This time on Poll Hub, two hot-button topics in American politics: transgender rights and housing. First, how the latest culture war issue collides with the challenges of being a teenager. For trans youth, these challenges are vast and a little dangerous. Then, why Americans agree on solutions to the housing crisis, but why we also can't seem to do much about it. And we finish with a question from 1949 that makes me, frankly, hungry. In fact, let's get this show on the road, because I gotta eat. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
I'm Emily DuPoint.
I'm Eve Fisher.
And I am Lee Marendal.
It's never been easy to be transgender, and while things have improved in the U.S. for trans people, trans rights have recently become a central culture war issue, especially for conservatives. And one of the biggest arguments within this culture war is about being trans for teens and kids. That inevitably has put schools into the mix, and it's become very messy.
Yeah, transgender students often encounter a variety of challenges when navigating school, like all kids do, but it's different for them. It starts with maybe the most basic thing, which is the lack of an agreement on what it even means to be transgender. In a Pew Research survey in 2022, a majority of people in that survey said that they believe a person's gender is determined by their assigned sex at birth. But nearly 4 in 10 said that gender can be more fluidly defined.
And there are big differences in how people view that question based on demographics. For instance, among those aged 18 to 29, 50% believe gender is set at birth, and 50% believe it can be different. 61% of Democrats and Democrat-leaning Americans view gender as fluid, while 86% of Republicans and Republican-leaning adults say gender is assigned at birth, and that's the end of the story. Here's Dr. Sarah Kipperman, licensed school psychologist, who has also done extensive research in LGBTQ youth advocacy at Wayne State University, with some insight on how this diversity of opinions impacts the experiences of transgender students in school.
So I think the hardest thing that a kiddo can go through is being scared to be themselves. And I think there's a difference between a moratorium, the idea that kids are exploring who they are, and a genuine fear of knowing who oneself is and knowing that there's a possibility that if I'm myself publicly and out loud, I could get beaten up. I could be susceptible to bullying that is tolerated and even condoned at some schools. So I think the hard part of having different opinions is the lack of safety that some opinions can have on kids.
Yeah, and this complexity creates a challenging environment for transgender students in schools. However, it's important to understand that these challenges, they don't exist in isolation. They're part of a broader societal context where attitudes and perspectives have been evolving over time. For instance, there's a Pew poll that we mentioned. They've asked the same question for several years, from 2017 to 2022, about this question of whether your sex is assigned at birth or whether it can be more fluid. The percentage answering that sex is assigned at birth has increased from 2017 to 2022 from 54 to 60%.
And that's the opposite of what's happened in the case of another hot-button culture war issue, same-sex marriage. Over the years, there's been a huge shift in acceptance and support for same-sex marriage. Gallup started asking Americans whether same-sex marriage should be legal in 1996. At that time, just 27% said it should. Support crossed the 50% mark in 2011, and when asked this past May, 71% said it should be legal.
So that evolution of public opinion on same-sex marriage offers insights into the potential for shifting attitudes and greater acceptance of transgender rights. One of the primary reasons for that shift on same-sex marriage, according to social scientists, was actually pretty simple. Most Americans have a family member or a friend who is gay. It's tougher to be prejudiced against people who are in your circle, in your tribe. And it demonstrates that societal views can evolve under the right circumstances. Dr. Kipperman is hopeful in the potential for these shifting attitudes when it comes to transgender rights.
I think the hardships of the political system right now are a little skewed, but my hope is that maybe this won't be this way forever. But I think when we see pushing in one direction, there has to be a pushback in an opposite direction. And the only way to do that is to have a voice, and one that people are willing to listen to. So not one that's attacking, but one that's willing to engage in conversation and share how people can benefit from human rights laws and protection.
While that same dynamic could play out for the trans community, there are far fewer trans individuals than people who identify as LGBTQ. But there's another important factor: education.
Yeah, education plays this huge role in fostering inclusivity and breaking down stereotypes. So where are we on that? Well, a May 2022 Ipsos poll showed 83% of American parents with children in elementary school said their kids have not learned about people who are transgender.
This lack of education poses a challenge. Without exposure to information about transgender experiences, children seem to struggle to understand and accept their transgender peers. Dr. Kipperman has some ways to bridge the gap between different viewpoints on gender identity in the school systems.
I think the most important thing is to not stop talking and pairing that with letting people know that we are not trying to harm someone by sharing our attitudes and beliefs.
So while schools are meant to be inclusive learning environments for all children, the reality is that transgender and gender nonconforming individuals often face exclusion and discrimination. Now, a study conducted by GLSEN in 2021 found that more than 43% of LGBTQ students felt unsafe at school due to their gender expression.
However, research published in JAMA Pediatrics in 2022 showed that transgender children who received medical support for their gender identities have significantly lower rates of depression and anxiety compared to those who lack support.
And research published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence in 2020 reported that 56% of transgender youth aged 14 to 18 have contemplated death by suicide.
Now, those are some pretty stark statistics that certainly highlight the importance of accessible mental health services that address these specific needs of transgender youth. And Dr. Kipperman shares the impact of non-inclusive environments and the negative outcomes they can create for these students.
When we think of there being greater rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, ideation, and follow through, we want to make sure we're not attributing that to kids inherently being transgender. This is because of the stressors that harmful opinions can have, because those harmful opinions are what lead to the stressors of bullying, harassment, isolation, which then exacerbates likeliness to experience that depression, that anxiety, and the negative outcomes because of the stressors and not because a kiddo is trans.
So it's clear that transgender students face unique challenges in navigating school, and at least in part because of this, some states have worked to create programs and pass laws in support of trans children. We've heard a lot about the opposite as well in the news cycles recently. Here's what Dr. Kipperman says she thinks the future of trans rights could be in our current political climate.
I do think in light of the political shift that we've seen and the lack of hope that there is, I think that it's still important to note that there's still a lot of community organizations that are available and that have not gone away. There's a lot of good things that are going on. And I think a lot of what we're doing just needs to continue to have those conversations, find the resources that do exist, find the therapists, the practitioners, the schools who do support youth. And for anyone who believes that these conversations don't apply to me and the youth that I support at my school because we don't have trans youth, that's absolutely incorrect. There are trans youth in every school. So the question is, do we want to ignore that these kiddos are there?
It's interesting to see how support can make a big difference for transgender kids' mental health. It's clear that we need to do more to help and understand them. To see some states taking steps to support trans kids is a start, but there's still a long way to go in this so-called culture war. So maybe the future of trans rights doesn't just depend on the court systems, lawmakers, and government, but maybe it depends on all of us.
In pretty much every city and state in America, there's a big problem with housing. It's too expensive, there's not enough of it, there's not the right mix of owned and rented.
Yeah, and there's a lot of reasons for this that we hear from experts. Inventory that didn't keep up with demand over the past decade, rising interest rates, those boomers who aren't selling, and of course, NIMBY, not in my backyard zoning, which thwarts or at least adds to the cost of constructing affordable homes.
But if you boil it all down, there's one primary problem. There just isn't enough housing being built.
And the repercussions of the housing crisis extend way beyond just short-term living conditions. For many Americans, it directly impacts upward mobility. With limited access to affordable housing, particularly a home ownership, the ability to accumulate wealth becomes significantly more challenging for a whole lot of folks.
According to Realtor.com, the gap between single-family home constructions and household formations grew from 5.5 million to 6.5 million homes between 2021 and 2022. However, including multifamily home construction reduces the gap to 2.3 million homes. Builders have been prioritizing multifamily units because Americans' median incomes have not kept up with rising housing prices, leading to more renters.
Yeah, and of course, experts do point to a lot of benefits to townhouse and apartment living. Multifamily units are generally better for the environment as they use fewer materials, they're more energy efficient, and they do promote population density and walkability. But as we know, there can also be a financial downside.
And that's because renters aren't building equity that comes from owning property. In the US, generational wealth is closely linked to owning a home. According to the 2019 survey of consumer finances, 61% of the total assets of American households are in their ownership of a primary residence.
Because everybody has to live somewhere. So arguments that investing the money people often put into home ownership, into better options that may have better returns, isn't really practical for many Americans, since most of that money would still go to having a place to live. So let's get back to housing. All housing is basically in short supply. When Americans are asked about solving it, there is a notable consensus. In most national surveys, around 3/4 of Americans support policies aimed at expanding investments in affordable housing development programs, with the objective of constructing more housing units that are accessible and affordable for lower, to middle income individuals and families.
And the support for more housing options is also evident at the local level. In the 2019 Cato Institute Welfare Work and Wealth National Survey, 59% of Americans said that they were in favor of building more housing in their neighborhood.
Yes, and add to that a 2022 Zillow survey of 26 metropolitan areas around the country. They revealed that this sentiment is shared by both homeowners and renters alike. 77% of the respondents supported adding more housing options in residential areas to improve affordability. Now, the options in reference here were backyard cottages, accessory dwelling units, duplexes, and triplexes. But as we know from the recent experience in New York State, where the governor proposed a program to essentially force suburban areas to add housing, it's much easier said than done. She faced massive resistance before ultimately pulling the proposal.
Dr. Bree Ling is a professor of economics at the University of California, Riverside. She says what happened in New York is common. Many cities and towns actively discourage new housing.
There's too many regulations or there's zoning requirements. It's just expensive to do it. And it's not coming from necessarily the input costs, but just getting through the process. So I know, again, I think a lot of states and municipalities are starting to look at this and say, what are we doing that's slowing down construction? And how can we change these regulations and streamline them to make it so developers don't have to bear this extra cost of trying to just get through all the red tape?
And yet there are some cities that have taken different approaches in dealing with the housing crisis.
Yes, for instance, Minneapolis was the first major city in the U.S. to end single-family zoning in just 2019. This allowed for more housing density and diverse housing types in residential neighborhoods. The aim here was to increase affordable housing options and foster inclusive housing development. In 2016, Portland implemented an inclusionary zoning policy that required developers of certain residential projects to set aside a percentage of units as affordable housing or to contribute to an affordable housing fund.
Then there's Seattle, which adopted a progressive approach to funding affordable housing by implementing a housing levy, which is a local property tax specifically dedicated to supporting affordable housing development and preservation. The city also uses a mandatory housing affordability program that requires developers to include affordable units in new residential projects or pay fees to support affordable housing efforts.
Still, a big part of this problem is basically many homeowners think new housing, especially multifamily units and starter homes, are going to drive down property values.
And since the bulk of Americans' wealth is in their homes, that's not an inconsequential worry. So how do we make it a win-win? Dr. Lang has some ideas.
We spend a lot of money giving people the opportunity to rent housing, and I often don't hear as many conversations about how to help people start building equity in a home. And I know some people aren't ready and, it's not a good time for them. If you're moving frequently, you don't want to buy a home because it's expensive to buy and sell homes. But I think, a bigger discussion about how to get, especially young people, they're coming up and housing is so expensive. How can we start sort of stepping people into home ownership and maybe putting some resources toward there and thinking about how to do that responsibly would be a good conversation to have more often.
Dr. Lang brings up a great point about getting the homeownership conversation started. It might be a good path forward, seeing as the housing issues only seem to be getting worse.
Well, considering that housing is much more than simply providing a roof over your family's head, the housing crisis is a complex issue with many nuances and certainly no easy answers. What polling does show is there is a big appetite, though, for tackling the problem. And that's a great place from which we can start.
All right, so now it's a fun fact. So I'm going to get into the show one way or another. I think Barb just said the word appetite. Well, that's somewhat related to where we're going with this. And the question was in the fun fact all the way back into 1949, which we dug up through the Roper Center at Cornell, their archives. The question is, if you had to cut out one meal, breakfast, noon, or a night meal, which would you be least willing to leave out? Now, I will start by saying that's not
Oh, ouch.
question in the history of, then again, it was 1949 and it was a tough period. And that's why they went with double negatives, I think. In any case,
Yeah,
the
that is
question
such a no-no in surveys. That sometimes you can't avoid it.
yeah, which would you be
because you
least willing
improve
to leave out means the thing you want to have the most. So of the choices of what the national audience at that point said, 48% said they would want mostly to have their night meal, 48%. Then breakfast was top of the list for 22%. 19% said a noon meal, which I guess means lunch. And 11% will eat everything regardless. So they just didn't know. All right, so here we go. Let's see, where would I jump in this? I would say breakfast not important, lunch somewhat important, dinner really important. So I would go with the majority or with the plurality here and say night meal, number one. Barb, you like to
I can't help but
always hungry.
wonder.
What do you want?
Yeah, I'll eat at any point and at any time, and especially if someone invites me to eat a meal, I'm happy to join them. Don't want to be insulting, but I always have a tough time with these double negatives. So one of the toughest ones is when you ask Americans whether they support or oppose a ban. And that's a similar kind of thing, a ban to something, because you have to oppose a ban means you support whatever the policy is.
That's all.
That's
fine.
a
That's all
long
fine
way
and
of
good.
that's a long way of saying that
Yeah.
I probably would have misanswered this question, because when you did read it aloud, I wasn't listening till the end.
Uh-huh.
Which I often don't do. And so I would have probably said breakfast, which is the meal I'd be most likely to cut out, because I'm
Okay.
usually not hungry till 11 and 12.
But
And
this
I
is
would also agree with the plurality.
you go dinner.
Don't want to miss dinner. Or though if I skipped breakfast and lunch, you probably wouldn't want to join me for dinner because I'm pretty
Yeah.
hungry.
There was no option, exactly, Jay. There was no option for a late night snack, which would probably be my number one. But anyway, so Jay, what you got here?
Yeah, so there's two things that I love about this, and the one thing I hate is you're right. I had to read it 3 times when the producers first put this in. I was like, what? They didn't get it. A terribly written question. So, but we can blame that. They're all 1949. The folks probably aren't still with us who wrote all these questions. Anyway, so here's what I love about this. One is that in 1949, lunch wasn't called lunch. There was dinner and supper, and dinner was the lunchtime meal, and supper was the dinner time meal in our modern parlance for many people. My grandmother grew up on in a farm in a rural area, and always called supper, and dinner lunch. And I was always confused as a kid. I was like, Grandma's crazy. She wasn't crazy. That's just how they talked then. But the other thing is that in modern nutritional science, this is the wrong answer.
Yes,
So, 48% of us, including me, I'm not going to give up dinner, are saying, no, I'm not willing to give up dinner. But the most important, at least the current thinking, and I don't know, tomorrow nutritional science will come up with something different, but breakfast is the most important meal, right?
Breakfast is what people say.
Yeah. So I love this for that reason. Is it makes us also think about what we think we want and what they thought they wanted in 1949 and what nutritional science now says we should.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Athen Hollis, Emily DuPoint,
Eve Fisher, and Delaney Hayes.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review.
Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub,
There is a subscribe button. Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcast app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.
Masses